You're a disgrace. You must apologize to Santa immediately.
The entire plane fell silent as the 7-year-old girl stood up, looked the flight attendant dead in the eye, and said words that would change everything on that Christmas Eve flight. Words so powerful, so innocent, yet so cutting, that grown men would later admit they had tears streaming down their faces. Words that would be replayed on news stations across the country for weeks. Words that would end a career and save a man's dignity. But let me tell you how we got here, because this story, this beautiful, heartbreaking, triumphant story, begins hours earlier in the chaos of Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport on the busiest travel day of the year. Her name was Tabitha Richardson, and at 7 years old, she was about to become the bravest person on Flight 2847 to Seattle. Now, Tabitha wasn't supposed to be brave that day. She was supposed to be nervous, scared even. Because this was her first time flying alone, her first time as what the airlines call an unaccompanied minor, with that special lanyard around her neck and a gate agent walking her right to her seat. Row 23, window seat, right over the wing where she could watch the ground disappear beneath the clouds. She clutched a worn teddy bear named Bartholomew, the same bear that had soaked up her tears for the past 6 months, ever since her father died. Her father, Pastor Richardson, a man who'd spent his life standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. A man who'd taught his daughter that silence in the face of injustice was just another form of participation. Tabitha didn't fully understand that lesson yet, not really, but it was there, planted deep in her heart like a seed waiting for the right moment to bloom. Her mother, a nurse working double shifts at Grady Memorial, had dressed her that morning in a little red coat, the one with the Christmas tree pin her father had given her last year. The pin was tarnished now, one of the branches slightly bent, but Tabitha refused to take it off. It was the last gift he'd given her before the cancer took him, before Christmas stopped feeling like magic and started feeling like a reminder of everything she'd lost. She was flying to Seattle to spend the holiday with her grandmother, who was recovering from surgery. Her mother couldn't get off work, couldn't afford to miss those shifts, couldn't afford much of anything anymore. So Tabitha was going alone, trying to be brave, trying to make her daddy proud, even though her hands shook as she buckled her seatbelt and pressed her face against the cold airplane window. Now, while Tabitha was settling into row 23 in coach, something very different was happening up in first class. Because that's where Cornelius Washington was sitting, in seat 3A, right up front where the seats were wider and the overhead bins were never full. Cornelius was 58 years old, with a full white beard that wasn't dyed or fake, wasn't part of a costume but was genuinely his. And when he smiled, which he did often despite his grief, his whole face lit up with a warmth that made children believe in miracles. For 20 years, Cornelius had been Santa Claus. Not just any Santa, but a Black Santa, running his own business called Cornelius's Christmas Workshop in Seattle. He'd built it from nothing, creating a space where Black children and children of color could sit on Santa's lap and see themselves reflected back. Where magic didn't have just one color. Where Christmas belonged to everyone. But this past year had nearly broken him. His wife, Martha, had died last Christmas Day. Just collapsed in their living room while they were watching their grandchildren open presents. The doctors said it was her heart, that it had just given out, but Cornelius knew better. Martha's heart had been too big, had given too much, had loved too hard, and maybe hearts like that just burn out faster. This was his first season back as Santa. He'd taken the whole year off, couldn't bear to put on the red suit, couldn't stomach the idea of ho-ho-hoing while his own heart was shattered. But then a children's hospital in Atlanta had called. They had kids, sick kids, dying kids, kids who might not see another Christmas, and they needed Santa. They specifically asked for him because they'd seen his work, knew his reputation, knew he brought something special that went beyond the costume. So Cornelius had gone. Had spent 3 days in that hospital, holding babies with cancer, listening to children whisper their wishes, taking photos with families who were memorizing every moment because they knew these might be their last. And he'd collected letters, dozens of them, written in shaky handwriting by children with IVs in their arms and hope in their eyes. Letters he kept in a worn leather satchel that never left his side. Letters that reminded him why he did this work even when it hurt. The airline had upgraded him to first class as a courtesy for his charity work. Cornelius didn't ask for it, didn't expect it, but he accepted it gratefully because his back wasn't what it used to be and the extra legroom helped. He'd dressed comfortably for the flight, just jeans and a sweater, but his Santa hat was tucked in his bag because he'd needed it for the hospital photos. That hat was his connection to Martha, the one she'd sewn for him by hand 20 years ago, the one he'd never replace. As he settled into his seat, Cornelius had no idea what was about to happen. Had no idea that the next few hours would test every ounce of dignity he'd spent a lifetime building. had no idea that his suffering would become someone else's awakening. Because working the first-class cabin that day was Bethany Keller, and Bethany Keller had a problem with people like Cornelius. She'd never admit it out loud, would never use certain words, would vehemently deny any accusations if confronted. But the truth lived in her actions, in her tone, in the way her smile turned sharp when she saw him boarding. The way her eyes scanned him up and down, calculating, judging, deciding he didn't belong. Bethany was 42, a senior flight attendant with 15 years at the airline. She wore her uniform like armor, every button polished, every hair in place, projecting an image of perfection and control. The first-class cabin was her domain, her kingdom, and she ruled it with an iron fist wrapped in a condescending smile. She came from money, generational wealth, the kind of family that had country club memberships and vacation homes. She'd never struggled for anything, never had to fight for respect, never had to prove she deserved to be somewhere. And maybe that's why she couldn't stand seeing others in spaces she deemed unearned. Maybe that's why she'd had multiple complaints filed against her over the years, complaints that somehow always got dismissed because she knew the right people, because she was related to someone on the board, because the system protected people like her. Her marriage had failed 3 years ago. No children, and that was a wound that never healed, a bitterness that fermented in her chest and came out in small cruelties toward others. She saw happy families and felt cheated. Saw children receiving kindness and felt resentful. Saw people like Cornelius with his gentle demeanor and genuine warmth, and felt threatened by something she couldn't name. The plane was packed that Christmas Eve afternoon, every seat filled with holiday travelers desperate to get home. In first class there was Priscilla, an elderly white woman with kind eyes, traveling to see her great-grandchildren. There was Silas, a businessman in an expensive suit, buried in his laptop. There was Lydia, a young mother traveling with a baby, grateful for the upgrade she'd gotten at the last minute. And there was Cornelius, completely unaware that his simple presence in seat 3A was about to become a problem. That Bethany's prejudices were about to collide with his dignity in a way that would force everyone on that plane to choose a side. If you're already feeling the tension building, if you want to see how this unfolds and witness what happens when innocence confronts injustice at 30,000 feet, hit that subscribe button right now. Because this story is about to take you on a journey you won't forget. Back in row 23, Tabitha was watching the boarding process with those observant eyes her father had given her. She saw Bethany's face when Cornelius walked past, saw the shift in expression that adults thought children didn't notice. She saw the way Bethany's smile was different for different people, warm for some, cold for others. And something in Tabitha's chest tightened, that same feeling she used to get at church when her father would preach about standing up for what's right. She didn't know yet that she'd need that feeling. Didn't know that in a few short hours she'd be called to live out her father's teachings in a way that would change her life forever. All she knew was that the man with the white beard who'd walked past her row had a sadness in his eyes that reminded her of her own reflection in the mirror. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration. Passengers stowed their bags and turned off their phones. The plane pushed back from the gate, and Atlanta began to shrink below them as they climbed into the gray December sky. It was Christmas Eve, a time for miracles and magic, for generosity and goodwill. But sometimes before the miracle comes, there has to be a test. Sometimes the darkness has to show itself completely before the light knows where to shine. And on Flight 2847, the darkness was just beginning to reveal itself. What would you do if you saw someone being treated unfairly right in front of you? Would you speak up, or would you stay silent and mind your own business? Drop your answer in the comments below, because this question is about to become very real for everyone on this flight. The moment Cornelius Washington stepped through that first-class curtain, everything changed. You could feel it in the air, that subtle shift in temperature, in energy, in the way Bethany Keller's entire body language transformed from professional hospitality into something else entirely. Something colder. Something calculated. Something that made Cornelius's smile falter just slightly as he made his way down the narrow aisle toward seat 3A. Bethany was stationed at the front of the cabin, greeting passengers with that practiced smile, the one that had been perfected over 15 years of service. She'd welcomed Priscilla with genuine warmth, complimented Silas on his briefcase, cooed at Lydia's baby with appropriate enthusiasm. But when Cornelius approached, that smile flickered like a candle in the wind. It didn't disappear completely, no, that would be too obvious. Instead, it shifted into something sharper, something that didn't quite reach her eyes, something that made Cornelius instinctively reach for his ticket even though he hadn't been asked for it yet. And then she spoke, her voice carrying through the cabin louder than it needed to, louder than it had for any other passenger. "Sir, I'm going to need to verify your ticket." Not a request, not a polite inquiry, but a statement dripping with suspicion, with assumption, with the unspoken implication that he must have made a mistake, that he couldn't possibly belong here. Cornelius, ever gracious, ever patient, pulled his boarding pass from his pocket and handed it to her. His hands were steady, but something in his chest was beginning to tighten. He'd felt this feeling before, too many times to count, that familiar sensation of having to prove himself in spaces where others simply existed without question. "Seat 3A, he said softly, his voice still holding on to that natural warmth that made children trust him. "I believe that's right here." Bethany examined the ticket as if it might be counterfeit, turning it over in her hands, checking the seat number not once but twice, her lips pursed in concentration that bordered on theatrical. She murmured, finally handing it back to him with fingertips that barely made contact, as if proximity itself was distasteful. But she wasn't done. Oh no, she was just getting started. As Cornelius moved to stow his leather satchel in the overhead bin, Bethany's voice cut through the cabin again. "Sir, excuse me, sir, I need to verify your ticket one more time." Other passengers were starting to look up now, their conversations pausing, their attention drawn to this unnecessary interaction. Cornelius turned back, confused, the satchel still in his hands. "Ma'am, you just checked it? Seat 3A. That's my seat right there." But Bethany wasn't listening, or rather she was listening but not hearing, not caring. She took the ticket from him again, studied it with exaggerated scrutiny, then looked him up and down in a way that made Cornelius feel exposed, diminished, as if his very presence required explanation. "I just need to be sure," she said, her smile now completely artificial, a mask stretched too tight. "We've had some issues with passengers ending up in the wrong cabin." "I understand," Cornelius replied, his voice still soft, still kind, even as something inside him was beginning to crack. "But as you can see, this is my assigned seat. The airline upgraded me for the charity work I do." He shouldn't have had to explain himself. He knew that. But he said it anyway, hoping that context might soften whatever was happening here, might remind this woman that he was a human being with a purpose, with dignity, with a reason to be exactly where he was. Bethany's expression didn't change. If anything, it hardened. "Right. Well, we'll see." She handed the ticket back to him a second time, and Cornelius finally, was allowed to sit down in seat 3A, the seat he'd been assigned, the seat he'd earned, the seat that suddenly felt less like an upgrade and more like enemy territory. And then, just as he was settling in, just as he was trying to shake off the discomfort of that interaction, Bethany's voice rang out again. "Sir? Sir, I'm so sorry, but I need to check your boarding pass one more time. There's been some confusion with the seating assignments." 3 times. She had asked him 3 times to verify his ticket. 3 times she had made him prove his right to occupy a space that required no proof from anyone else. And Cornelius Washington, a man who had spent 20 years bringing joy to children, a man who had just spent 3 days holding dying babies in a hospital, a man who carried the weight of his wife's death in every breath he took, felt something inside him begin to crumble. Not anger, not yet. Something worse. Resignation. The tired, soul-deep weariness that comes from having to justify your existence over and over and over again. He showed her the ticket a 3rd time. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply complied because he'd learned long ago that compliance was often the only way to survive these encounters, that resistance only gave people like Bethany the ammunition they were looking for. Meanwhile, back in row 23, Tabitha Richardson was watching all of this unfold. She'd noticed Bethany's tone during boarding, had seen the way the flight attendant's face changed when Cornelius appeared. Tabitha's father had taught her to see these things, to notice when people were being treated differently, to recognize injustice even in its subtle forms. And there was nothing subtle about this. Even at 7 years old, Tabitha could feel the wrongness of it, could sense that the man with the white beard and the sad eyes was being targeted for reasons that had nothing to do with tickets or seat assignments. She clutched Bartholomew tighter, her small fingers digging into the worn fabric of the teddy bear, and something in her chest began to burn. Not fear this time. Something else. Something that felt like her father's voice echoing in her heart, reminding her that silence was participation, that watching wrong happen was its own kind of wrong. The plane finished boarding. The doors closed. The safety demonstration began, and Bethany finally moved away from Cornelius, though her eyes kept drifting back to him, watching, monitoring, waiting for him to give her a reason to act on the prejudice she was barely concealing. But the harassment was just beginning. Because once the plane was in the air, once the seatbelt sign dinked off and the first-class service began, Bethany's microaggressions evolved into something more deliberate, more visible, more cruel. She started with the pre-flight beverage service, rolling her cart down the aisle with mechanical efficiency. "What can I get you to drink?" she asked Priscilla, her voice honey-sweet. "Champagne for the elderly woman, served in a proper glass flute." "And for you, sir?" she asked Silas, who requested whiskey, received it in crystal with ice and a napkin. Lydia got sparkling water with lemon, delivered with a warm smile and a compliment about her baby's outfit. And then Bethany's cart reached row 3, reached Cornelius Washington, and something remarkable happened. She didn't stop. She didn't ask. She simply rolled right past him as if he were invisible, as if seat 3A was empty, as if the man sitting there didn't exist at all. Cornelius waited, thinking perhaps she'd forgotten that she'd circle back. He watched her continue down the aisle, serving every single first-class passenger, laughing at jokes, making small talk, embodying the image of gracious service. And then she returned to the front of the cabin, began organizing her cart, completely bypassing him again. Finally, Cornelius raised his hand slightly, politely, the way a student might in a classroom. "Excuse me, ma'am? Might I have something to drink?" His voice was gentle, apologetic even, as if he were the one who had done something wrong by existing, by being thirsty, by expecting the service that every other passenger had received without asking. Bethany turned to him, and that fake smile returned, stretched thin and sharp. "I'll get to you when I can, sir." For words delivered with such casual dismissiveness that they landed like a slap. Not a promise to return soon. Not an acknowledgement that she'd overlooked him. Just a vague, condescending assurance that maybe, eventually, if he waited long enough, if he proved himself patient enough, she might deign to serve him. 20 minutes passed. 20 minutes during which Bethany made multiple trips up and down the aisle, refreshing drinks for other passengers, chatting about holiday plans, laughing at stories about grandchildren and vacation destinations. 20 minutes during which Cornelius sat in his seat, thirsty, humiliated, watching everyone around him receive the basic courtesy that he'd been denied. When Bethany finally returned with a drink for him, it wasn't champagne in a flute or whiskey in crystal. It was water in a plastic cup, the kind they gave to coach passengers, the kind that was disposable and cheap and utterly different from what everyone else had received. She set it down on his tray table without a word, without eye contact, without even the pretense of service. Cornelius looked at that plastic cup, at the lukewarm water inside it, and felt something twist in his stomach. Not anger still. Not yet. Just a deep, profound sadness that this was still happening, that in 2024 on Christmas Eve, he was still being told in 1,000 small ways that he was less than, that he didn't deserve, that his presence was merely tolerated rather than welcomed. He took a sip of the water, trying to focus on something else, anything else. His eyes drifted to his leather satchel tucked under the seat in front of him, and he remembered the letters inside, the children's faces, the reasons he did what he did. And then he noticed that his Santa hat, Martha's hand-sewn Santa hat, had slipped out of the bag and was now on the floor near his feet. Cornelius leaned forward to retrieve it, a simple movement, reaching down to pick up something that belonged to him. But before his fingers could close around the red fabric, Bethany's voice sliced through the cabin like a knife. "Sir. Sir, you need to remain seated. Stop causing disruptions." Cornelius froze, his hand outstretched, his body bent awkwardly in the cramped space. "I'm sorry, I was just reaching for my hat. It fell from my bag. I need you to stay seated, sir. The seatbelt sign may come on at any moment." Bethany's tone was sharp now, authoritative, loud enough that every passenger in first class turned to look. Loud enough that the implication was clear. This man was a problem, this man was causing trouble, this man needed to be controlled. And that's when Priscilla, sweet elderly Priscilla in her cardigan and pearls, spoke up. "Oh, for heaven's sake, he's just getting his hat, dear. There's no harm in that." Her voice was gentle but firm, the kind of voice that carried the weight of 70-plus years of witnessing nonsense and finally having enough of it. Bethany's head snapped toward Priscilla, her expression shifting from authoritative to defensive in an instant. "Ma'am, I'm handling this. I need to ensure all passengers comply with safety regulations." The words were professional, but the tone was anything but. It was clipped, irritated, as if Priscilla had committed some grave offense by pointing out the obvious absurdity of the situation. Cornelius managed to grab his hat and sat back up, holding the worn red fabric in his hands like a talisman. He could feel every eye in first class on him now, could sense the discomfort radiating from the other passengers, that peculiar mixture of sympathy and inaction that defines so many moments of injustice. People knew this was wrong. They could feel it. But knowing and acting are two very different things, and most people most of the time choose the path of least resistance. They choose silence. The plane continued its journey toward Seattle, climbing through clouds, the cabin settling into a false calm. Cornelius tried to focus on the window, on the sky beyond, tried to breathe through the tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with altitude and everything to do with the systematic degradation he was experiencing. He'd been through worse, he reminded himself. He'd survived worse. He could endure this. But Bethany wasn't finished. Not even close. The drink service continued, and as Bethany maneuvered her cart through the aisle, she passed directly by Cornelius's seat. Now the aisle in first class wasn't wide, but it was wide enough for a cart to pass without issue if you were careful. Bethany wasn't careful. As she rolled past row 3, as Cornelius sat there with his hands folded in his lap, trying to make himself as small as possible, Bethany's cart bumped hard against his armrest. The plastic cup of water on his tray table wobbled, tipped, and then spilled directly onto Cornelius's lap, soaking his jeans, spreading cold wetness across his legs. Cornelius gasped, jumping slightly in his seat, his hands automatically reaching to minimize the damage. "Oh, I'm so sorry," he began as if the spill had been his fault, as if he'd somehow caused the cart to hit his armrest, as if he were responsible for the water now dripping onto the floor. But Bethany didn't apologize. Didn't offer napkins. Didn't acknowledge her role in what had just happened. Instead, her voice rose, sharp and accusatory, carrying through the entire first-class cabin with unmistakable intent. "Sir, I'm going to need you to calm down. Are you intoxicated?" The words hung in the air like poison. Intoxicated. She'd said it loud enough for everyone to hear, loud enough that passengers in the rows behind first class could probably hear it too. She'd said it with such certainty, such authority, that for a moment, the other passengers actually looked at Cornelius differently, actually wondered if maybe there was something they'd missed, if maybe this gentleman with the white beard had somehow become a threat. Cornelius's face went through a series of emotions in rapid succession. Shock, confusion, hurt, and then finally something that looked like resignation. "Ma'am," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "I haven't had anything but water, which you just spilled. I'm not intoxicated. I'm just trying to get to Seattle to see my grandchildren for Christmas." But Bethany was committed to her narrative now, committed to painting this man as a problem that needed solving. "Sir, I'm going to need you to calm down, or I'll have to report you to the captain. Disruptive passengers are taken very seriously on this airline." She crossed her arms, her body language screaming authority and threat, making it clear that Cornelius's protestations meant nothing, that his truth was irrelevant in the face of her power. Other passengers were shifting uncomfortably now. Silas, the businessman, closed his laptop and looked directly at Bethany. "He hasn't done anything wrong," Silas said, his voice firm. "I've been sitting right here and he's been nothing but polite." Bethany's gaze snapped to Silas, her expression hardening further. "Sir, please don't interfere with crew operations. I'm trained to identify disruptive behavior, and I need you to let me do my job." The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop. That's what it feels like when injustice happens right in front of you, when you're forced to witness cruelty and decide whether you're going to be complicit or courageous. Most of the passengers looked away, suddenly finding their magazines fascinating, their phones urgent, their window views captivating. The bystander effect in full force, that psychological phenomenon where the presence of others actually decreases the likelihood of anyone taking action. But back in coach, in row 23, Tabitha Richardson heard everything. The walls between first class and coach weren't soundproof, and Bethany's accusations had been loud enough to carry. Tabitha's small hands gripped the armrests of her seat, her knuckles going white. She could hear the injustice in that woman's voice, could sense the fear underneath the man's polite responses. And something in her 7-year-old heart began to crack open, began to fill with a courage she didn't know she possessed. She reached down and unclipped her seatbelt, the metallic click barely audible over the hum of the engines. The flight attendant assigned to coach was busy in the back galley, and Tabitha was small enough that people didn't always notice her. She clutched Bartholomew tight against her chest and began to stand up, her legs shaky but determined. Up in first class, Cornelius was trying desperately to clean up the spilled water with his hands, water that was soaking into the carpet, into his clothes, into his dignity. His leather satchel was still under the seat in front of him, and he reached for it now, thinking tissues, thinking something to help dry the mess, thinking anything to end this nightmare. But the moment his hand closed around the satchel strap, Bethany was there, looming over him. "Sir, I need to search that bag." Cornelius looked up at her, confusion and fear now mixing in his eyes. "I'm sorry, what? Why? You're exhibiting suspicious behavior. I have the authority to search any passenger's belongings if I believe there's a safety concern." Her voice was cold, professional, the kind of tone that made everything sound official and justified even when it was anything but. Cornelius's grip tightened on the satchel. "Ma'am, this is just letters. Letters from children. They're personal, they're private, and I'd really rather. If you have nothing to hide, sir, you'll comply." Bethany reached for the bag, her intentions clear, her authority assumed. "Please," Cornelius said, and now there were tears forming in his eyes, actual tears threatening to spill down his weathered cheeks. "These letters are from sick children. They're sacred to me. They're all I have left of." His voice broke. He couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't say that these letters were the only thing keeping him going, that they were his connection to purpose after Martha's death, that they represented every reason he still got up in the morning. But Bethany didn't care about sacred things. Didn't care about grief or purpose or the sanctity of a dying child's handwritten wishes. She grabbed the satchel from Cornelius's hands, yanked it harder than necessary, and the worn leather couldn't hold. The clasp gave way and suddenly letters were everywhere. They exploded from the bag like birds taking flight, dozens of pieces of paper fluttering through the first-class cabin. Children's drawings with crayons and markers, showing Santa with brown skin and a white beard. Handwritten letters in shaky cursive. "Dear Santa, my name is Timothy. I have cancer. I don't want toys, I just want my mom to stop crying." Photographs of Cornelius holding babies with no hair, their tiny heads wrapped in hospital blankets, their smiles so brave and so heartbreaking. Letters that said, "Thank you for visiting me," and "You're the only Santa who looks like me," and "Please don't forget me." They scattered across the floor, across seats, into the aisle. And Cornelius watched them fall with an expression of such profound anguish that several passengers actually gasped. These weren't just letters to him. They were testimonies. They were proof that his life had meaning. They were the voices of children whose society had already started to forget, children whose time was running out, children who'd trusted him with their deepest wishes and fears. Bethany picked up one of the letters, read it with a mocking smile, and then looked at Cornelius with undisguised contempt. "Oh, so you're Santa Claus? This is ridiculous." She dropped the letter, let it flutter back to the floor like it was trash, like it was nothing. "Sir, this behavior is completely unacceptable. You'll be removed from the flight when we land and dealt with by security." Cornelius didn't respond. Couldn't respond. He simply dropped to his knees in the cramped space between the seats and began gathering the letters with trembling hands. Each one he picked up was a child's face in his memory. Timothy with leukemia. Sarah with a brain tumor. Little James, who died 2 days after Christmas last year. Martha would know what to do, he thought desperately. Martha would know how to handle this. But Martha was gone and he was alone, and these letters were all he had left. The other passengers watched in horrified silence. Priscilla's hand was over her mouth, her eyes glistening with tears. Silas had pulled out his phone, fingers hovering over the screen, wanting to document this but afraid of making things worse. Lydia held her baby closer, whispering reassurances that were more for herself than her child. And Bethany stood over it all, arms crossed, victorious in her cruelty, certain that she'd proven whatever point she'd been trying to make. That this man didn't belong here. That people like him needed to be controlled, suspected, diminished. That her authority was absolute and her judgment was law. But she'd made one critical mistake. She'd forgotten about the 7-year-old girl in row 23, the girl who'd been watching and listening and remembering every word her father had ever taught her about standing up for what's right. Tabitha Richardson was standing now, Bartholomew clutched in one arm, her father's Christmas tree pin catching the cabin light. And she was walking toward first class with a determination that belied her small size, with a courage that was about to change everything. Have you ever witnessed someone being treated unfairly and regretted not speaking up? What stops us from defending others when we know something is wrong? Share your thoughts in the comments, because what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about courage. And if this story is hitting you as hard as it's hitting me, hit that subscribe button because you need to see how this unfolds. Tabitha Richardson was 7 years old, but in that moment, standing in the aisle of coach class with her worn teddy bear Bartholomew pressed against her chest, she felt ancient. She felt the weight of every lesson her father had ever taught her, every sermon she'd sat through about justice and righteousness and standing up when others sit down. She felt her father's hand on her shoulder even though he'd been dead for 6 months, felt his voice in her ear as clear as if he were sitting right beside her. "Baby girl, silence in the face of wrong is just another way of saying yes to it." And Tabitha Richardson, 7 years old, 4 feet tall, traveling alone for the first time in her life, decided that she was going to say no. She unbuckled her seatbelt with small fingers that didn't shake, not anymore. The fear she'd felt during takeoff, that nervous energy that had made her clutch Bartholomew so tight his stuffing might burst, had transformed into something else entirely. Something that felt like fire in her chest, like her father's spirit burning through her, like courage she didn't know a child could possess. The flight attendant assigned to coach, a woman named Deborah who'd been nothing but kind to Tabitha, emerged from the galley just as Tabitha stepped into the aisle. "Sweetie, you need to stay seated," Deborah said, her voice gentle but firm, moving toward this small passenger who was supposed to be under special supervision. "The seatbelt sign isn't on, but unaccompanied minors need to remain in their assigned seats unless they need to use the restroom." Tabitha looked up at Deborah with eyes that were too old for her face, eyes that had seen her father waste away in a hospital bed, eyes that had watched her mother cry herself to sleep night after night, eyes that had just witnessed a good man being destroyed for no reason other than existing. "That lady is being mean to Santa," Tabitha said, her voice small but steady, each word deliberate and true. "My daddy always said when you see wrong you stand up." Deborah hesitated, caught between protocol and conscience. She'd heard the commotion from first class, had heard Bethany's accusations, had felt the wrongness of it echoing through the cabin. But she was junior staff and Bethany was senior, and the hierarchy of airlines was as rigid as any military structure. "Sweetie, I understand, but you need to let the adults handle this." "My daddy was an adult," Tabitha interrupted, and there were tears in her eyes now but her voice didn't waver. "And he said sometimes adults forget how to do the right thing. He said sometimes it takes someone small to remind them." And before Deborah could respond, before anyone could stop her, Tabitha Richardson pushed past the flight attendant and headed toward the curtain that separated coach from first class. The blue fabric partition hung there like a border between worlds, between the space where Cornelius was suffering and the space where Tabitha had been sitting in helpless witness. She grabbed the edge of that curtain with her tiny hand, the one not holding Bartholomew, and she pulled it aside and stepped through into first class like a warrior entering battle, like David approaching Goliath, like every underdog in every story who decided that size didn't matter when righteousness was on your side. The entire first-class cabin turned to look at her. Every single passenger, every single one of them who'd been watching Cornelius gather scattered letters from the floor, every single one of them who'd been sitting in uncomfortable silence while injustice played out right in front of them, they all turned and saw this small black girl in a red coat with a Christmas tree pin on her lapel, clutching a teddy bear, standing in the aisle with tears streaming down her face and fire in her eyes. Bethany Keller's head snapped toward the movement, her expression shifting from triumphant cruelty to irritated confusion. "Little girl," she said sharply, using that tone adults use when they expect immediate obedience, when they assume their authority is absolute and unquestionable. "Little girl, you need to return to your seat immediately. You're not supposed to be in this cabin." But Tabitha didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge Bethany's command at all. Instead, she walked right past the flight attendant, walked past Priscilla who was crying quietly into her hands, walked past Silas who was frozen with his phone still hovering uncertainly in the air, walked past Lydia who was holding her baby and whispering prayers under her breath. Tabitha walked directly to where Cornelius Washington was kneeling on the floor, his weathered hands gathering letters with such tenderness, such reverence, such broken-hearted care that it made your chest physically hurt to witness. And then this 7-year-old girl, this child who should have been afraid, who should have stayed in her seat and minded her own business like every adult in that cabin had done, she knelt down right next to Cornelius. She set Bartholomew gently on the floor beside her, and she began picking up letters. "What do you think you're doing?" Bethany's voice was sharp now, edged with something that might have been panic because this wasn't in her script, this wasn't how this was supposed to go. "Young lady, I am ordering you to return to your seat right now, or there will be serious consequences." Tabitha didn't even look at her. She picked up a piece of paper, a drawing done in crayon showing Santa with brown skin and a white beard, standing next to a Christmas tree. She picked up another letter, this one written in shaky handwriting on lined paper. She picked up a photograph of Cornelius holding a baby, and she studied it with such focus, such intensity, that the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Cornelius turned to her, this stranger child who'd appeared like an angel, and his eyes were so full of tears and gratitude and confusion that he couldn't speak. He opened his mouth to say something, to thank her, to tell her she didn't have to do this, but no words came out. Only a sob, choked back, swallowed down, because he'd been holding it together for so long and this small act of solidarity was threatening to break him completely. Tabitha looked at him and smiled, a smile that was sad and brave and so much like her father's smile that if Pastor Richardson could have seen her in that moment, he would have burst with pride. "It's okay," she whispered to Cornelius. "I'm going to help you." And then she picked up one of the letters, unfolded it carefully and began to read aloud. Her voice was small, but it carried through the cabin with perfect clarity, with devastating innocence, with the kind of truth that only children can speak because they haven't yet learned to soften reality for the comfort of others. Dear Santa, Tabitha read, her finger following the words on the page. My name is Timothy. I am 6 years old. I have cancer in my blood. The doctors say I might not be here next Christmas. I don't want toys this year. I just want my mom to stop crying. She cries every night when she thinks I'm sleeping. Can you make my mom happy again? That's all I want. Love, Timothy. The cabin went completely silent. Not the uncomfortable silence from before, but something deeper, something sacred, something that happens when truth is spoken so purely that it cuts through every layer of pretense and prejudice and social conditioning. The kind of silence that forces you to confront yourself, to look at who you are and who you've chosen to be in moments that matter. Priscilla's quiet crying became audible sobbing. Silas's hand was over his mouth, his eyes squeezed shut. Lydia pulled her baby closer, kissing the top of her child's head over and over as if proximity could protect against the cruelty of a world where 6-year-olds wrote letters asking Santa to make their mothers stop crying. And Tabitha, sweet brave Tabitha, looked up from that letter directly at Bethany Keller. Looked at her with eyes that saw everything, that saw past the uniform and the authority and the carefully constructed facade, that saw right down to the hurt and bitterness and emptiness that made someone treat another human being the way Bethany had treated Cornelius. These are from kids who are really sick, Tabitha said, her voice shaking now but not with fear. With emotion. With righteousness. With the kind of moral clarity that adults spend their whole lives trying to recapture. Why are you being so mean? It was such a simple question. Such a child's question. The kind of question that adults would couch in complexity and nuance and social theory. But Tabitha just asked it straight. Why are you being so mean? And in that simplicity was a power that all of Bethany's authority couldn't match. Bethany's face flushed red. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She could handle accusations of discrimination, could deflect complaints about service, could justify her actions with procedure and policy and protocol. But how do you explain meanness to a 7-year-old? How do you justify cruelty to someone who hasn't yet learned all the sophisticated ways adults rationalize their prejudices? Young lady, Bethany stammered, her voice losing that sharp authority, becoming flustered and defensive, this doesn't concern you. This is between me and this passenger, and you need to. My daddy said people who hurt others are just hurt inside themselves, Tabitha interrupted, and the cabin somehow got even quieter if that was possible. Every ear was straining to hear this child's words, every heart was breaking and healing simultaneously. My daddy said when someone is mean, it's usually because they're sad or scared or lonely. Are you hurt inside? Is that why you're being mean to him? The question hung in the air like a bomb that had been dropped but hadn't yet exploded. Because it wasn't asked with malice. It wasn't asked with accusation or judgment. It was asked with genuine curiosity, with childlike concern, with the kind of empathy that sees even cruel people as human beings who are suffering in ways they don't know how to express. And that innocence, that directness, that pure unblemished compassion, it disarmed everyone. It reached past every defense, every justification, every wall that Bethany had built around herself and touched something raw and real and vulnerable that she'd been hiding for years. For a moment, just a moment, Bethany's face cracked. The mask slipped. And beneath the authority and the cruelty and the prejudice, you could see something else. Pain. Deep, unprocessed pain. The pain of a failed marriage. The pain of a childless life in a world that measures women's worth by their ability to nurture. The pain of always feeling less than, despite the wealth and the status and the carefully curated image of success. The pain that she'd been inflicting on others because she didn't know how to heal it in herself. But the moment passed. The mask came back. And instead of softening, instead of allowing that vulnerable truth to be seen, Bethany hardened even further. Because sometimes when people are confronted with their own ugliness, they don't change. They double down. And then something beautiful happened. Something that would be replayed in Tabitha's mind for the rest of her life. Something that would remind her that even when you stand alone, sometimes others find the courage to stand with you. Priscilla, elderly Priscilla in her cardigan and pearls, began to clap. Slowly at first, deliberately, her aged hands coming together with purpose and power. And then Silas joined her, standing up from his seat, his applause filling the cabin. And then Lydia, shifting her baby to one arm so she could clap with the other. And then other passengers, one by one, until the entire first-class cabin was applauding this 7-year-old girl who'd done what none of them had been brave enough to do. Silas stepped into the aisle, positioning himself between Bethany and Tabitha, his body language protective and firm. "This has gone far enough," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came not from a uniform but from moral certainty. "This man has done nothing wrong. Nothing. And this child has shown more courage and decency in the last 2 minutes than all of us adults have shown in the last hour." Other passengers began to speak up, their voices overlapping, their testimonies creating a chorus of truth that Bethany couldn't silence or dismiss. "I saw everything. He's been nothing but polite. You targeted him from the moment he boarded. This is discrimination, plain and simple. That little girl is right, what you're doing is just mean." Bethany looked around the cabin, saw the faces of people who were no longer silent, no longer complicit, no longer willing to let this continue. And in that moment she made a choice. Not the choice to back down, not the choice to apologize, not the choice to recognize her wrong and make it right. No, Bethany Keller made the choice that people like her always make when they're cornered, when their power is threatened, when they're forced to confront the consequences of their actions. She escalated. Feeling humiliated, feeling exposed, feeling the loss of control that terrified her more than anything else, Bethany grabbed her phone from her pocket with shaking hands. Her voice when she spoke was high and tight, panic barely contained beneath a veneer of authority. "I'm calling the captain. Both of you will be escorted off this plane when we land. This is unacceptable. This is..." "No." The word burst from Tabitha like a cry, like a wound opening up, and suddenly she wasn't brave anymore. She was 7 years old and scared and crying, real crying, the kind of crying that shakes your whole body. "Please don't take him away. Please. He's the only Santa who looks like me. He makes kids like me believe in magic. Please don't take him away." And that's when Cornelius Washington, this man who'd been silently enduring humiliation and cruelty, this man who'd been gathering letters with trembling hands while his dignity was stripped away piece by piece, he finally moved. He put his arm around Tabitha's shaking shoulders and pulled her close, this stranger child who defended him when no one else would, and he spoke for the first time since the letters had scattered. "It's okay, sweetheart," Cornelius said, his voice thick with emotion, with gratitude, with a sadness that carried the weight of a lifetime of these moments. "It's okay. Sometimes doing good means facing bad. Sometimes standing up for what's right means people try to punish you for it. But you did the right thing. You hear me? You did exactly what your daddy would have wanted you to do." Tabitha buried her face in Cornelius's shoulder, her small body shaking with sobs, and he held her like she was one of his grandchildren, like she was precious and valuable and worthy of protection. And in that moment something shifted in the cabin. Because now this wasn't just about a man being mistreated. Now there was a child involved. Now Bethany's cruelty had an innocent victim. And people who might have stayed silent about an adult's suffering found their voices when they saw a 7-year-old girl crying. Lydia, the young mother who'd been quietly witnessing everything, made a decision. She pulled out her phone, opened her camera app and pointed it directly at Bethany. The red recording dot appeared on the screen, documenting everything, capturing this moment for posterity and justice and the court of public opinion that would judge what happened here today. Bethany noticed immediately, her eyes widening, her body stiffening. "Recording is not allowed on this aircraft," she shouted, reaching toward Lydia as if she could stop this, as if she could control the narrative even now. "You need to put that away immediately, ma'am, or you'll face consequences too." But Lydia didn't lower her phone. Instead, she smiled, the kind of smile that contains both sadness and satisfaction, both disappointment in humanity and hope for accountability. "Actually," Lydia said calmly, her voice steady and sure, "it is allowed. There's no federal regulation against passengers recording during flight. And the whole world is going to see this. Every single second of what you've done to this man. Every word you've said to this child. All of it." The phone kept recording. The red dot kept glowing. And Bethany Keller finally understood that she'd lost control of the situation completely, that her authority meant nothing in the face of truth being documented, that all her power and position couldn't protect her from the consequences of her own cruelty when the evidence was being broadcast to the world in real time. If you've ever wondered whether one person can really make a difference, whether standing up actually matters, this is your answer. Subscribe now because what happens next will restore your faith in justice, and you need to see how courage, even in the smallest form, can change everything. The tension in that first-class cabin had reached a breaking point, the kind of pressure that makes the air itself feel heavy, that makes every breath an effort, that makes you wonder if something is about to shatter or explode or irrevocably change. Bethany stood there with her phone clutched in her white-knuckled grip, panic and rage warring across her face. Lydia kept recording, her camera capturing every moment of this unraveling. Cornelius held Tabitha close, both of them trembling for different reasons. And the other passengers sat frozen in their seats, witnesses to something they'd never forget, participants in a moment that would define how they saw themselves for years to come. And then the cockpit door opened. Captain Silas emerged into the cabin with the kind of presence that only comes from years of command, from the weight of responsibility for hundreds of lives, from the understanding that leadership means seeing clearly when everyone else is blinded by emotion or fear or prejudice. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with gray at his temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of countless flights, countless decisions, countless moments where he'd had to cut through chaos and find truth. He'd been radioed by Bethany minutes earlier, her voice high and urgent over the crew communication system, claiming there was a security threat in first class, claiming there were unruly passengers who needed to be restrained, claiming the situation required immediate captain intervention. Standard protocol dictated that he take such claims seriously, that passenger safety was paramount, that flight attendants were trained professionals whose assessments carried weight and authority. But Captain Silas was also a man who'd learned over 30 years of flying that truth was rarely simple, that situations were never quite as they appeared in panicked radio calls, that the most dangerous threats to a flight weren't always the ones people reported. So when he emerged from that cockpit, he didn't come out with assumptions or predetermined conclusions. He came out to observe, to assess, to see with his own eyes what was actually happening in his aircraft. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. A small black girl in a red coat, 7 years old at most, kneeling on the floor surrounded by scattered papers. A gentle-looking older black man with a white beard, his arm around the child, both of them with tears streaming down their faces. Children's letters and drawings spread across the carpet like fallen leaves. Other passengers with their phones out, recording, some crying, some angry, all of them focused on one person. His senior flight attendant, Bethany Keller, who stood in the aisle looking cornered and desperate and nothing at all like someone in control of a security situation. Captain Silas's eyes swept the cabin in a matter of seconds, taking in body language, reading the room with the kind of expertise that comes from decades of managing human behavior in confined spaces at 30,000 feet. He saw Priscilla's protective posture toward the man and child. He saw the businessman Silas standing in the aisle like a guardian. He saw Lydia holding her phone steady, documenting everything. He saw the tension, yes, but not the kind of tension that comes from a threat. The kind that comes from injustice being witnessed and finally challenged. And then the businessman spoke, his voice carrying across the cabin with unmistakable recognition. "That's my brother." He pointed at the captain, then gestured to himself. "Captain Silas is my brother." The coincidence of names wasn't lost on anyone, but right now it didn't matter. What mattered was that this businessman, this passenger who'd been silent for too long before finally standing up, had a connection to the man who held all the power on this aircraft. And that connection suddenly shifted the dynamics in ways that made Bethany's face go pale. Captain Silas moved further into the cabin, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp, missing nothing. He stopped a few feet from where Cornelius and Tabitha were still kneeling, surrounded by those sacred letters. "What exactly is the threat here?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying an edge that suggested he already suspected the answer wouldn't match the emergency he'd been told about. And then everyone spoke at once. It was like a dam breaking, like all the silence and complicity and bystander paralysis that had kept people frozen suddenly gave way to an urgent need to tell the truth, to bear witness, to make sure this captain understood exactly what had happened on his aircraft. "She's been harassing him since boarding." Priscilla's elderly voice cracked with emotion. "She made him show his ticket 3 times, and didn't ask anyone else. She refused him service," another passenger called out. "Served everyone else drinks and completely ignored him. She spilled water on him and then accused him of being drunk." Silas the businessman stepped forward, his corporate authority lending weight to his words. "I've been sitting right here watching the whole thing. This man has been nothing but polite, nothing but patient, and she's been targeting him from the moment he sat down. She searched his bag." Lydia's voice rose above the others. "Those are letters from sick children and she dumped them out like they were trash. She mocked him for being Santa Claus. She threatened to have him arrested when he gets off the plane." Another passenger shouted. "And then this brave little girl came to help him, and the flight attendant threatened her too." The testimonies overlapped, creating a chorus of accusation and truth that left no room for ambiguity, no space for misinterpretation. Captain Silas listened to all of it, his face growing harder with each word, his jaw tightening as the full picture of what had transpired in his cabin became crystal clear. He held up a hand and the cabin fell silent immediately. That's the power of a captain's authority, the respect that comes not from cruelty or intimidation but from competence and command. "I need to see documentation," he said quietly, looking at Cornelius. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass and identification?" Cornelius, still holding Tabitha, reached into his pocket with a shaking hand and produced his boarding pass and driver's license. Captain Silas examined them carefully, noting the first-class seat assignment, noting the upgrade notation on the ticket. Then Cornelius reached down to the scattered papers and picked up a laminated credential card, handing it to the captain without a word. Captain Silas studied the card, and his expression shifted from neutral to something that looked like profound disappointment mixed with anger. The card identified Cornelius Washington as the proprietor of Cornelius's Christmas workshop, listed his charity credentials, showed his clearance for the Children's Hospital event in Atlanta. It had official stamps, signatures from hospital administrators, commendations from child welfare organizations. This wasn't just some passenger. This was a man who'd dedicated his life to bringing joy to suffering children, and he'd been treated like a criminal on this flight. The captain looked up from the credential card, his gaze moving to Bethany, who seemed to shrink under the weight of it. But before he addressed her, he turned to Tabitha. He knelt down so he was at her eye level, his voice gentle in a way that suggested he had children of his own, grandchildren perhaps, people he loved who'd taught him how to speak to scared little girls with tears on their faces. "Young lady," Captain Silas said softly, "can you tell me your name?" Tabitha wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her voice small and shaky. "Tabitha Richardson, sir. I'm 7 years old and I'm traveling to Seattle to see my grandmother." "Tabitha, you're an unaccompanied minor, which means you're supposed to stay in your assigned seat unless you need to use the restroom. Can you tell me why you left your seat and came into first class?" And this is where Tabitha Richardson, 7 years old, orphaned by cancer, scared and brave and so much like her father that Pastor Richardson's spirit must have been singing in heaven, she looked that captain right in the eyes and spoke truth with a clarity that cut through every regulation and protocol and rule that had ever been written. "Because nobody else was helping," Tabitha said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "That lady was being mean to him for no reason and everybody was just sitting there watching, and my daddy taught me to be brave. My daddy said when you see somebody hurting somebody else, you don't just sit there. You stand up. Even if you're scared. Even if you're small. Even if everyone else is staying quiet. You stand up because that's what brave people do, and my daddy said I was brave." The cabin was so quiet you could hear the engines humming, could hear someone's breath catching, could hear the soft sound of Priscilla crying into her hands. Captain Silas held Tabitha's gaze for a long moment, and then he did something unexpected. He smiled. Not a big smile, not a happy smile, but a smile that contained respect and recognition and a kind of sadness that comes from realizing a child understands morality better than most adults ever will. "Your daddy was right," Captain Silas said quietly. "You're brave. One of the bravest people I've ever met." He stood up then, his attention shifting to Bethany, and the gentleness in his voice disappeared completely, replaced by cold professional authority. "Miss Keller, I need you to step aside with me for a private conversation. Now." Bethany's mouth opened as if to protest, but the look on the captain's face made it clear this wasn't a request. It was an order. She followed him toward the galley area, her shoulders hunched, her earlier confidence completely evaporated, replaced by the body language of someone who knows they're about to face consequences they can't talk their way out of. But before they could have that private conversation, before Captain Silas could address Bethany's behavior away from passenger eyes, another voice spoke up. Phoebe, the flight attendant who'd been working in the back galley, who'd witnessed some of this interaction, who'd been with the airline long enough to recognize patterns and know when silence becomes complicity, stepped forward. "Captain," Phoebe said, her voice shaking slightly but determined, "I need to say something. This isn't the first time." Captain Silas turned to her, his eyebrows raised. "Explain." Phoebe glanced at Bethany, saw the warning in her colleague's eyes and made a choice. The same choice Tabitha had made. The choice to speak truth even when it's uncomfortable, even when it might cost you something, even when staying quiet would be easier. Last month there was a passenger named Ezra. A young black man traveling in first class for a business meeting. Bethany did almost the exact same thing. Questioned his ticket multiple times, provided substandard service, made him feel unwelcome. He filed a complaint but it was dismissed. Said there wasn't enough evidence, that it was just a misunderstanding. And then, like a flood breaking through a dam, other passengers began pulling out their phones. Not to record this moment but to show the captain something else. Social media posts. News articles. Trending hashtags. Because in the age of the internet, nothing stays hidden for long, and Bethany's pattern of behavior hadn't gone unnoticed by the wider world even if it had been dismissed by her employers. Look at this. Silas the businessman held up his phone screen. There are multiple threads on Twitter about her. Passengers sharing stories. All following the same pattern. All involving black passengers in first class. All dismissed as isolated incidents. Here's a TikTok from 3 months ago. Another passenger called out, showing their screen. A woman recorded Bethany refusing to let her use the first-class bathroom even though she was a first-class passenger. Said it was occupied, when it clearly wasn't. The woman was black. Instagram post from last year, Lydia added, still holding her baby with one arm and her phone with the other. Family traveling together, upgraded to first class as a courtesy for their disrupted flight. Bethany separated the black father from his family, claimed there was a seating error that didn't exist, tried to move him back to coach. The evidence kept coming, phones thrust forward like accusations, screens glowing with testimonies from strangers who'd never met each other but shared the same experience of being treated as less than, of being profiled and targeted and discriminated against by a flight attendant who'd hidden behind policy and protocol and plausible deniability. Captain Silas took in all of this information, his face growing darker with each revelation. This wasn't an isolated incident. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a bad day or a personality conflict. This was a pattern. A clear, documented, undeniable pattern of discriminatory behavior that had been allowed to continue because the system that was supposed to stop it had failed repeatedly. He turned back to Bethany, who stood there looking smaller now, her authority stripped away, her justifications meaningless in the face of overwhelming evidence. "Miss Keller," he said, his voice cold and formal, "do you have anything to say?" Bethany's face was red, her hands clenched at her sides. She tried to muster that authoritative tone, tried to reclaim some semblance of control. "I was just doing my job," she said, her voice defensive and sharp. "I was ensuring passenger safety, following security protocols, maintaining order in the cabin. That's what I'm trained to do. That's what I'm paid to do. If passengers feel uncomfortable with standard safety procedures, that's not my fault. I can't be held responsible for." "Your job," Captain Silas interrupted, his voice cutting through her excuses like a blade, "is to serve all passengers with dignity and respect. Your job is to ensure safety, yes, but not by profiling passengers based on the color of their skin. Your job is to follow protocols, yes, but those protocols apply equally to everyone, not selectively to people you've decided don't belong. Your job is to represent this airline with professionalism and integrity, and you have failed at every single aspect of that responsibility." Bethany's mouth snapped shut, her eyes wide with something that might have been fear or shock or the dawning realization that she couldn't talk her way out of this, couldn't dismiss it, couldn't hide behind technicalities or connections or the protection of a system that had shielded her for too long. "You are removed from cabin duties effective immediately," Captain Silas continued, his words carrying the weight of finality. "You will remain in the jump seat for the remainder of this flight. You will not interact with passengers. You will not perform any service duties. And when we land, you will be met by airline management and likely federal authorities, because what happened here today isn't just a violation of company policy. It's potentially a violation of federal civil rights laws regarding discrimination in air travel." Bethany opened her mouth as if to protest, but Captain Silas held up a hand. "That is not a discussion, Miss Keller. That is a direct order from the captain of this aircraft. Go sit down. Now." And Bethany, stripped of her authority, stripped of her power, stripped of the protection she'd relied on for so long, walked to the jump seat at the back of the cabin and sat down. She didn't look at the passengers as she passed. Couldn't meet their eyes. Couldn't face the evidence of what she'd become, of what she'd been allowed to be, of the pain she'd inflicted on people who'd done nothing wrong except exist in spaces she'd decided weren't meant for them. Captain Silas turned back to Cornelius, and his expression softened completely. "Sir, on behalf of this airline, I offer you my sincerest apology. What happened to you today is inexcusable, unacceptable, and does not represent the values we claim to uphold. I am deeply, deeply sorry." Cornelius looked up at the captain, still holding Tabitha, still surrounded by those letters from sick children, and his eyes filled with tears again. But these were different tears. Not tears of humiliation or pain or hopelessness. Tears of relief. Of validation. Of finally being seen and believed and treated like the dignified human being he'd always been. "Thank you," Cornelius whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Thank you for listening. Thank you for believing us." Captain Silas nodded, then turned his attention to Tabitha. "Young lady, you need to return to your seat now. But before you go, I want you to know something. What you did today took more courage than most adults will ever possess in their entire lives. Your father would be incredibly proud of you. I hope you know that." Tabitha nodded, wiping her eyes, starting to stand. But before she could move away, before she could return to coach in her assigned seat and the loneliness of traveling without her father, Cornelius reached into his bag. He pulled out his Santa hat, the one Martha had sewn for him 20 years ago, the one that had survived countless Christmas seasons and hospital visits and moments of joy and sorrow. He held it in his weathered hands for a moment, looking at it like it was the most precious thing in the world. And then he placed it on Tabitha's head. The red fabric was too big for her, sliding down almost over her eyes. Cornelius adjusted it carefully, gently, his hands steady now, his tears still falling but his smile genuine and warm and full of gratitude that transcended words. "Thank you for reminding me why I do this," Cornelius said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for standing up when no one else would. Thank you for seeing me as a person, as Santa, as someone worth defending. You're the real Santa today, sweetheart. You gave me the greatest gift anyone could give. You gave me back my dignity. You gave me back my faith in people. You're the real Santa." And then the entire first-class cabin erupted in applause. Not polite applause. Not obligatory applause. Thunderous, heartfelt, tearful applause that acknowledged what they'd witnessed, what they'd been part of, what this 7-year-old girl had done that they'd all been too afraid or too complacent or too conditioned to do themselves. They applauded her courage. They applauded her compassion. They applauded the fact that sometimes, just sometimes, the smallest voice in the room is the one that changes everything. Silas the businessman stepped forward, tears streaming down his face unashamedly. "Tabitha," he said, his corporate authority completely abandoned in favor of genuine human emotion, "would you do me the honor of sitting in first class for the rest of this flight? I'd like to upgrade your seat. I'd like you to sit right here next to Mr. Washington, if that's okay with you." Tabitha looked up at him with wide eyes, the Santa hat still perched on her small head, and she nodded. A flight attendant who wasn't Bethany, a kind woman who'd been horrified by everything she'd witnessed, helped Tabitha gather her things from coach, brought Bartholomew and her little backpack and helped her settle into the seat next to Cornelius. And as the plane continued its journey toward Seattle, as Christmas Eve afternoon turned to evening, as the cabin settled into a new kind of peace, one born not from silence but from justice, Tabitha Richardson sat in first class wearing Santa's hat, holding her teddy bear, and finally felt like maybe, just maybe, her father was proud of her. If this story has moved you, if you believe that courage matters regardless of age or size, hit that subscribe button. Because the world needs more people like Tabitha, and every time we share stories about standing up for what's right, we remind ourselves that change is possible. The applause eventually faded, the way all applause does, returning the cabin to the gentle hum of engines and the quiet conversations of passengers who just witnessed something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Tabitha Richardson sat in seat 3B now, right next to Cornelius Washington, the Santa hat still perched on her small head, Bartholomew clutched in her arms. The letters had been carefully gathered and returned to Cornelius's leather satchel, though a few remained spread across the fold-down tray tables between them, tangible reminders of the sacred work that had nearly been destroyed by one person's prejudice. For a few moments they sat in silence. Not the uncomfortable silence that had filled the cabin during Bethany's harassment, but a companionable quiet, the kind that exists between people who've been through something profound together, who fought a battle side by side and emerged victorious but exhausted, triumphant but tender. Tabitha's small hand rested on the armrest between them, and Cornelius's larger hand, weathered and wrinkled and warm, covered it gently. "I lost my wife," Cornelius said finally, his voice soft, almost tentative, as if he wasn't sure whether this 7-year-old stranger would understand the weight of those words. "Last Christmas Day. Her name was Martha. She'd been my partner for 37 years, my best friend, my everything. She's the one who sewed this hat you're wearing. She believed in what I did, in the Santa work, even when other people thought it was silly or frivolous. She said bringing joy to children was the most important work anyone could do." Tabitha turned to look at him, her young face serious, her eyes reflecting an understanding that shouldn't have been possible for someone so small. "I lost my daddy," she said quietly. 6 months ago. He was a pastor. He had cancer and it hurt him really bad, but he never stopped smiling. Never stopped telling me to be brave and kind and stand up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. He said that's what Jesus would do, so that's what we should do too. "Your daddy sounds like he was a very wise man," Cornelius said, his throat tight with emotion. I wish I could have met him. He would have loved meeting you, Tabitha replied, a small smile breaking through her sadness. He would have said you're a real Santa not just because of the beard or the workshop, but because you have a Santa heart. That's what he used to say about people who were really good. He'd say they had a Jesus heart or a Santa heart, and it meant the same thing. It meant they loved people even when it was hard. Cornelius had to look away for a moment, had to press his palm against his eyes to stop the tears that threatened to spill again. This child, this impossibly brave and beautiful child, had just articulated something he'd been struggling to understand since Martha's death. That the work mattered not because of the costume or the ho-ho-hos or the photo opportunities, but because of the love underneath it all. The genuine, unconditional love for children, for humanity, for the magic of believing that goodness exists even in a cruel world. Can I show you the letters? Cornelius asked, pulling the satchel onto his lap. Can I tell you about the children who wrote them? Tabitha nodded eagerly, scooting closer, and for the next 20 minutes, Cornelius opened that sacred collection and shared the stories. He pulled out Timothy's letter, the one Tabitha had read aloud earlier, and he told her about meeting 6-year-old Timothy in the oncology ward, how the boy's eyes had lit up when he saw a Santa who looked like him, how Timothy had whispered his wish about his mother's tears with such earnest hope that Cornelius had to excuse himself afterward to cry in a hospital bathroom. He showed her Sarah's drawing, a picture of Santa standing next to a little girl with no hair, both of them smiling under a bright yellow sun. Sarah has a brain tumor, Cornelius explained, his finger tracing the crayon lines. She drew this after I visited her. She told me she used to be afraid of dying, but after talking to Santa she wasn't scared anymore because she knew there was magic in the world, and magic meant anything was possible. Even miracles. He pulled out a photograph of himself holding a baby, tiny and fragile, hooked up to more tubes and wires than seemed possible for something so small. This is James. He died 2 days after Christmas last year. His parents asked me to visit because they wanted him to meet Santa before he left. I held him for an hour. Just held him. His mother took this picture. She sent it to me with a letter saying that the hour I spent holding her baby was the only hour that whole month that she'd felt peace. That seeing her son in Santa's arms made her believe he'd be taken care of, wherever he was going. Story after story, letter after letter, child after child. Each one a name, a face, a soul that had touched Cornelius's life and left an imprint that would never fade. And Tabitha listened to every single one with rapt attention, her small face reflecting the weight of each tragedy, the beauty of each moment of connection, the sacred responsibility Cornelius carried in that worn leather satchel. They're lucky to have you, Tabitha said when he'd finished, her voice full of a wisdom that transcended her years. All those kids are lucky that there's a Santa who sees them, who knows their names, who makes them feel special. My daddy used to say the worst thing in the world is being invisible, being forgotten. You make sure those kids aren't invisible. Cornelius's vision blurred with tears again, and he pulled Tabitha into a hug, this stranger child who defended him, who understood him, who saw the purpose in his work when someone else had tried to make it seem ridiculous. Thank you, he whispered into her hair, the Santa hat tilting sideways. Thank you for reminding me why this matters. They pulled apart, and Cornelius reached into his bag again, this time pulling out sheets of drawing paper and colored pencils. You know what we should do? He said, a smile breaking through the sadness on his face. We should make paper airplanes. Martha and I used to make them every Christmas Eve. We'd write messages of hope on them and throw them out into the world, like prayers with wings. Tabitha's face lit up with genuine joy for the first time since boarding the plane. Really? Can we write messages for the sick kids? We can write messages for anyone who needs hope, Cornelius replied, already folding a piece of paper into the classic airplane shape. For the sick kids, for your mama working those double shifts, for my grandchildren who miss their grandmother, for everyone on this plane who maybe needs a reminder that goodness exists. They worked together, folding and writing, creating a small fleet of paper airplanes that carried messages like, you are loved, miracles happen, courage wins, magic is real, you matter, and tomorrow will be better. Tabitha's handwriting was messy, the letters big and uneven, but each word was written with such care, such intention, such belief that the messages would reach someone who needed them. And then something beautiful happened. Other passengers began approaching their row, one by one, tentatively at first and then with increasing confidence. They came to apologize, to acknowledge their silence, to admit that they should have spoken up sooner, that they should have been the ones to defend Cornelius, that their comfort had been prioritized over his dignity and they were ashamed of that choice. Priscilla came first, her elderly hands shaking as she reached out to touch Cornelius's shoulder. "I'm so sorry," she said, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. "I should have done more. I should have been louder. I should have stood up like this precious child did. I've lived 73 years, and I let a 7-year-old show more courage than I could muster. Please forgive me." "There's nothing to forgive," Cornelius said gently, taking her hand. "You spoke up when others didn't. You tried. That matters." But Priscilla shook her head, pulling something from her purse. It was a small Christmas ornament, delicate and old, a silver angel with detailed wings. "This belonged to my mother," she said, holding it out to Tabitha. "She gave it to me when I was about your age, told me it was for courage. For those moments when doing the right thing feels impossible. I want you to have it now because you've earned it more than I ever did." Tabitha took the ornament with reverent care, her small fingers closing around it like it was the most precious thing she'd ever received. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll take care of it forever." Silas the businessman came next, his expensive suit rumpled now, his corporate composure completely abandoned. "I sat there," he said, his voice breaking. "I sat there and watched it happen for way too long before I said anything. I kept telling myself it wasn't my business, that I shouldn't get involved, that someone else would handle it. I'm disgusted with myself. My brother is the captain of this plane, and I almost let this injustice happen right in front of me because I was afraid of being uncomfortable." "But you did speak up eventually," Cornelius replied. "You stood up. You used your voice. That took courage too." Lydia approached with her baby, the child now sleeping peacefully in her arms. "I recorded it," she said, her voice firm despite the tears on her face. "And that video is already going viral. It's been shared thousands of times in just the last hour. People need to see what happened here today. They need to know that this still happens, that discrimination isn't just history, it's present, it's real, it's ongoing. But they also need to see this little girl's courage. They need to see that standing up matters. They need to see you, Mr. Washington, and know that your dignity was never diminished by someone else's hatred." One by one they came. Passengers who'd been silent, who'd looked away, who'd been complicit through their inaction. They came to apologize, to witness, to acknowledge that they'd been changed by what they'd seen, that they'd never be able to sit silently through injustice again because a 7-year-old girl had shown them what courage looked like. The plane began its descent into Seattle, the captain's voice coming over the intercom with the standard announcements about local time and weather and preparing for landing. But there was something different in Captain Silas's tone, something warm and personal that wasn't usually part of the script. "Folks, this is your captain speaking. We're beginning our final descent into Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. I want to thank you for flying with us today, and I want to say something that's not standard procedure but needs to be said. Today on this flight we witnessed something extraordinary. We witnessed injustice, yes, but we also witnessed courage. We witnessed a child teaching adults what it means to stand up for what's right. We witnessed humanity at its worst and its best, sometimes in the same moment. When you leave this aircraft today, I hope you'll remember what you saw here. I hope you'll remember that silence in the face of wrong is its own kind of wrong. And I hope you'll remember that it's never too late to be brave. Thank you for flying with us and Merry Christmas." The landing was smooth, the wheels touching down on rain-slicked runway as Seattle's gray December evening welcomed them home. The plane taxied to the gate, and as it came to a stop, passengers remained seated, not rushing to grab their bags and push into the aisle the way they usually did. Instead, they waited, watching as Cornelius and Tabitha gathered their things, as if wanting to see this story through to its conclusion, as if their witness was still needed. When the aircraft door opened, airline executives were waiting at the gate. Not customer service representatives, not gate agents, but actual executives in suits with serious expressions and prepared statements. They approached Cornelius immediately, offering formal apologies on behalf of the airline, promising full investigations, assuring him that what happened today was unacceptable and would have consequences. And Bethany Keller, stripped of her uniform, was escorted away by airline security and what looked like federal agents. She didn't look at Cornelius as she passed. Didn't look at Tabitha. Kept her eyes on the ground as she was led away to face the consequences that had been delayed for far too long. Later, it would be revealed that she was terminated immediately, that the investigation uncovered years of complaints that had been dismissed, that federal civil rights violations were being pursued. But in that moment, all that mattered was that her reign of cruelty was over. But what Cornelius and Tabitha saw when they emerged into the terminal was something neither of them expected. News crews. Cameras. Reporters with microphones. Because Lydia's video hadn't just gone viral, it had exploded across social media platforms, had been picked up by news outlets, had sparked national conversation about discrimination in air travel, about bystander intervention, about the power of children to shame adults into doing better. A reporter approached them carefully, respectfully, asking permission before filming. "Mr. Washington, Tabitha, the video of what happened on your flight has been viewed millions of times in just the last 2 hours. People all over the country are talking about what this little girl did. Tabitha, can you tell us what made you speak up? What made you leave your seat and defend a stranger?" Tabitha looked up at the cameras, still wearing Cornelius's Santa hat, still holding Bartholomew, and she answered with the kind of simple truth that would be quoted and shared and remembered long after this news cycle ended. "Because everybody deserves kindness, especially at Christmas." 7 words. That's all it took. 7 words from a 7-year-old girl to sum up everything that had happened, everything that should have been obvious, everything that adults had somehow forgotten in their rush to protect themselves and avoid discomfort and maintain the status quo. The reporter's eyes filled with tears. The camera operator wiped his face. People waiting in the terminal stopped to listen, to watch, to bear witness to this moment of clarity delivered by a child who understood humanity better than most people twice or 3 times or 10 times her age. "Mr. Washington," the reporter continued, "what do you want people to take away from what happened today?" Cornelius looked down at Tabitha, his hand resting on her shoulder, and then looked back at the camera. "I want people to know that discrimination isn't always loud. It's not always obvious. Sometimes it's quiet and polite and dressed in professionalism. It's being asked to prove your right to exist in a space. It's being served last or not at all. It's having your dignity stripped away in small increments until you're not sure if what you're experiencing is even real. But it is real. And it matters. And it takes people like this brave young lady to remind us that we can't stay silent, that we can't look away, that every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of the color of their skin or how much money they have or where they're sitting on an airplane." The interview continued for a few more minutes, but those words would be the ones that trended, that were clipped and shared, that became part of the larger conversation about race and discrimination and the courage it takes to challenge systems that have been broken for so long they've started to feel normal. Finally, the news crew stepped back, and Cornelius and Tabitha made their way through the terminal toward arrivals. Tabitha's hand was tucked into Cornelius's, and they walked together like family, like people who'd known each other for years instead of hours, like people whose souls had recognized each other in a moment of crisis and formed a bond that couldn't be broken. And then Tabitha saw her grandmother and she ran. Ran with her little red coat flying behind her, ran with the Santa hat bouncing on her head, ran into the arms of a woman who grabbed her and held her and cried into her hair. Grandmother and granddaughter reunited on Christmas Eve, both of them holding on tight because family is everything, especially when you've already lost so much. Cornelius hung back, giving them their moment, but Tabitha's grandmother looked up and saw him standing there. Saw this man with the white beard and the gentle eyes and the leather satchel full of children's letters. And somehow, even without being told the full story, she knew. She knew this man was important. She knew something significant had happened on that flight. "You must be the Santa my grandbaby was telling me about on the phone," she said, her voice warm with gratitude. "Thank you for watching over her." "Ma'am," Cornelius replied, stepping forward, "your granddaughter watched over me. She saved me today in more ways than you can imagine." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, one that listed his workshop, his phone number, his email. "If you're ever in Seattle and need anything at all, you call me. Tabitha is family now. You both are." The grandmother took the card with trembling hands, understanding in her eyes that something profound had happened, that her granddaughter had been forever changed by this flight, that this man standing before her was more than just a stranger in an airport terminal. Cornelius reached into his satchel one more time, pulling out a small ornament wrapped in tissue paper. He knelt down so he was at Tabitha's eye level and carefully unwrapped it, revealing an angel ornament with brown skin, delicate wings spread wide, a serene smile on her face. It was old, handcrafted, beautiful in a way that spoke of love and care and attention to detail. "Martha made this," Cornelius said softly, placing it in Tabitha's small hands. "She made it for our daughter, who grew up and has daughters of her own now. But I think Martha would want you to have it. For the bravest angel I've ever met." Tabitha held the ornament carefully, studying every detail, and then she threw her arms around Cornelius's neck and held on tight. "Thank you for letting me help you," she whispered. "Thank you for being Santa. Thank you for making kids like me feel special." They held each other for a long moment, two people who'd found each other in the midst of injustice and created something beautiful out of something ugly. Two people who'd reminded each other why kindness matters, why courage counts, why standing up for what's right is never wasted even when it's hard. And finally they pulled apart. Tabitha stood there wearing the Santa hat, holding Bartholomew in one arm and the angel ornament in the other, surrounded by her grandmother's love and Cornelius's blessing. The Christmas tree pin on her red coat caught the terminal lights, and for just a moment she looked like exactly what she was. A small beacon of hope in a world that desperately needed reminding that goodness exists. That Christmas Eve, a 7-year-old girl reminded an entire plane full of adults what courage really means. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the biggest truth. And sometimes when the world feels dark, all it takes is one person, no matter how small, to stand up and say, "This isn't right." Cornelius Washington continued his Santa work for many years after that flight. The story of what happened brought attention to his workshop, brought donations and volunteers and children from all over the country who wanted to meet the Santa who'd been defended by a brave little girl. He never forgot Tabitha Richardson. Never forgot the way she'd knelt beside him and gathered those sacred letters. Never forgot the courage it took for someone so small to stand up when everyone else sat down. Tabitha Richardson grew up carrying the lessons her father had taught her and the courage she'd discovered within herself on that Christmas Eve flight. She went to college, then law school, and eventually became a civil rights attorney, dedicating her life to standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves, just like her father had taught her, just like she'd done for Cornelius when she was 7 years old. And every Christmas, without fail, Tabitha would visit Seattle. She'd go to Cornelius's Christmas workshop with her own children eventually, and later her grandchildren. They'd sit together and read letters from sick children, letters that still came in by the dozens because Cornelius's work never stopped mattering. They'd make paper airplanes with messages of hope. They'd remember that flight, that moment, that choice to be brave when being silent would have been easier. And they'd remind each other that magic is real. It's not found in flying reindeer or chimneys or North Pole workshops. It's found in human courage. It's found in compassion that crosses the boundaries of age and race and circumstance. It's found in the willingness to stand up and say, "This isn't right," when everyone else is looking away. Magic is real. It just sometimes needs a brave heart to defend it. What would the world look like if we all had the courage of a 7-year-old girl who refused to stay silent? If this story reminded you that one voice can change everything, that standing up always matters, that kindness is the most powerful force in the universe, then subscribe to this channel. Because these are the stories we need to hear, to remember, to carry with us into a world that's hungry for heroes and has forgotten that heroes come in all sizes, all ages, all colors. Heroes look like Tabitha Richardson. And maybe if we're brave enough they can look like us too.